remain seated. The session will begin now. Thank you.
السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكريم، برحب بحضراتكم في فعاليات اليوم الأول لمنتدى مصر للتعاون الدولي والتمويل الإنمائي في نسخته الثانية. برحب بحضراتكم في فعاليات الجلسة النقاشية الأولى، والتي تأتي تحت عنوان الانتقال من مرحلة التعهدات إلى مرحلة التنفيذ، تحويل الالتزامات المالية إلى فرص في إفريقيا، حيث تعد القيود المتعلقة بالحصول على التمويلات من أهم التحديات التي تحول دون السماح للبلدان الإفريقية بتعزيز استثماراتها في مجال العمل المناخي وتحقيق التنمية المستدامة، ومن أجل مناقشة أعمق حول كيفية الانتقال من التعهدات إلى التنفيذ، يعقد منتدى مصر للتعاون الدولي والتمويل الإنمائي هذه الجلسة النقاشية. ومن أجل مناقشة أعمق ندعو متحدثين الكرام للتفضل بالصعود على المنصة. السيدة الدكتورة رانيا المشاط، وزيرة التعاون الدولي لجمهورية مصر العربية. السيدة مافالتا دوارتي، الرئيس التنفيذي لصناديق الاستثمار في المناخ. السيد هيروشي ماتانو، نائب الرئيس التنفيذي للوكالة الدولية لضمان الاستثمار. السيدة الدكتورة كيريان جونز، نائبة الأمين العام لمنظمة التعاون الاقتصادي والتنمية. السيد الدكتور محمود محي الدين، رائد المناخ للرئاسة المصرية لمؤتمر المناخ كوب 27. السيد مارك كارني، المبعوث الخاص للأمم المتحدة المعني بالعمل والتمويل المناخي، رئيس تحالف غلاسكو المالي الجديد من أجل صافي انبعاثات صفرية. السيد هيبولايد فوفاك، كبير الاقتصاديين في بنك التصدير والاستيراد الإفريقي. وتدير هذه الجلسة السيدة إليني جيوكوس، مراسلة ومذيعة قناة CNN.
Can you hear me? Wow, what a fantastic day. It has been absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience. A warm welcome to everyone. It has been absolutely illuminating hearing from the best around the world on what to do to ensure we do not get derailed from our climate change agenda. Welcome to my distinguished guests, my panelists. It's an honor to have you on stage with me. We've had so much to talk about and listen to throughout the day, and we're going to try and pick out some of those key themes. Today's focus is going to be on climate financing, from pledges to implementation. It perhaps has been one of the biggest sticking points, and not only from Glasgow, but also from what we saw during COP15. I want to take you back to 2009, where we had huge commitment on the table. The big focus was $100 billion per year. We fell short of that. A lot of the money that was put on the table actually went to already developed economies. Only 20% went to developing economies, most of which went to middle-income countries. I want to give you these stats, this data, because it's absolutely vital to understand where Africa stands and where emerging markets stand, where the global south stands. Africa receives only about 5.5% of global financing when it comes to climate change. It is minuscule. And yet Africa's needs are growing. It's around $250 billion per annum for the next 10 years at least. So how do we close this gap? Why does it exist? We've discussed some of these. We've heard from some of the experts already today. We need bankable projects. We need blended financing. We need to mobilize local resources. All of these things need to be on the agenda. So thank you once again for joining us. And of course, Dr. Rania, I'm going to start with you. You haven't spoken enough today. And my question to you is, you know, we gathered last year. It was ahead of Glasgow. We were so optimistic that, you know, Africa, the global south, was going to be put on the table in a very meaningful way. And perhaps it was. There was a huge disconnect because I think 46 countries walked away from Glasgow feeling that they weren't happy with the outcomes. We had an incredible conversation about what you wanted to see. We're now, heading towards COP here in Egypt. Congratulations. I think it's such a vital thing that it's happening on the continent. I want you to take me through what you're expecting in negotiations and things that you will not make concessions on to ensure that we are still the main focus.
Okay, so on negotiations, that's one thing that I will not speak about because a Ministry of Foreign Affairs is responsible for that track. But I learned from Glasgow that there's the negotiation track and then there's everyone else.
Yeah.
So we are all in that everyone else space. And everyone else space includes the stakeholders that actually make it work. Make it work in terms of finance, make it work in terms of inclusivity, make it work in trying to make sure that the priorities nationally are not forgotten. When you say, what do I expect that we show an example as Egypt, and this is what we were discussing today through our nexus of water, food, and energy.
Yeah.
We launched Egypt Country Platform for NWAFI. What we want to show is that there's a government that is very clear about its goals when it comes to climate change, that has been designed within a climate strategy that does not miss the link between climate and development. They come hand in hand. So other than seeing climate as a burden on countries, what we're trying to say is we've actually intertwined it into our development agenda. So this is a very strong message that we want to bring to COP. This COP, we want it to be one of adaptation and resilience. The geopolitical issues in Europe has shown that food security is important for all countries around the world, not relevant to one continent. And therefore, for Africa, food security, water security are key. And therefore, adaptation and resilience are important. And that's why the nexus of water, food, and energy includes food, includes water projects. And then finally, the energy transition. We've seen the pressure on countries from oil prices. We are blessed as a continent and as Egypt with potential renewable resources. So again, trying to identify what each stakeholder needs to do for us to move to that transition is what we try to capture under Egypt's Country Platform for NWAFI. And finally, we also will be sharing with everyone the Sharm el-Sheikh guidebook for just financing, where we try to put together what each stakeholder needs to do to move from pledges to implementation.
And with NWAFI, you put your money where your mouth is. You're taking out concessional loans, so you're putting in the effort. But I want to take this a step further because I think we need to take a step back. Hippolyte, I'm looking at you, sir. And the reason is you're an economist. You look at the numbers, you're crunching them. I always wonder why there's this huge gap. And I guess we've said bankable projects, there are other issues, but it's so enormous that one wonders why, specifically for emerging markets and for African countries specifically.
No, thank you very much.
us?
I think, yes, you may think that it's a big gap. But when you think of what was spent for COVID-19 in terms of fiscal response by advanced economies, it was several $1 trillion within a year, isn't it? In fact, $14 trillion for European Union alone. I think it may look very huge, but it's not that huge in relative term. But the gap is there and has been there for some time actually. And the key reason is, why do we have such a huge gap? And quite frankly, when you look at the fiscal space within the African continent, it is such that it would be difficult to mobilize domestic resources in the short term. And a couple of years ago, if I remember 2018, the IMF looked at the issue of domestic position across the African continent, and the conclusion was tackling. They said, after 2 decades of attempt to raise domestic mobilizations, it has remained a challenge. Africa remained the regions with the lowest revenue to GDP ratio in the world, and the latest number that I can think of were about 20% versus 28% for emerging developing market economies, and 29% for Asia, and 42% for Europe. So that's where the fiscal space is. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to expect African to mobilize those resources in the short term. But what is also very important is that it's not that there is a constant fiscal space. The little resources that they have within the continent is also constrained when it comes to deployment by a number of challenges that the continent faces, which are unique to the continent. One of them, as you know, is the yield spread. You look at the yield spread of Africa versus relative to the US, it's minimum 10%, if you look at Ghana, 20%. And those are essentially massive resources which are drained out of the continent, making it difficult for the region to respond properly to some of these challenges. So I think, in my view, is that it's a combination of factors, the narrow fiscal space, which reflect the structure of African economies, which are not diversified enough, and then the issue of the prohibitively high cost of debt servicing, which also drain the resources.
Thank you so much for breaking that down for us. And I'm going to repeat this. Africa does not have the fiscal space, right? We've proven it. And especially during the pandemic, I'm glad you made, you alluded to it, because the money that Africa spent was sort of a drop in the ocean compared to what, one country in Europe spent, for example. Hiroshi, I want to come to you. The World Bank has been so pivotal in investing in renewable energy. But also has been focusing on sorting out the energy deficit that exists on the continent. I want to talk about sort of the big macro issue and perhaps the elephant in the room, that many African countries are asked to turn away from their natural resources during a time of energy deficit in order to embark on the climate change agenda, and that governments have this huge dilemma of lives versus livelihoods. How do we tackle these pertinent issues when we hear shut down coal-fired power plants, entire communities are need to transition as well into different types of jobs? How do we create a balancing act with regards to that? Because that means financing.
Well, that's an excellent question. And but before I answer, I just want to, since we're talking about numbers and statistics, we just came out, we announced how much we delivered in climate last year. So we delivered a record 58.3 billion US dollars in the last 2 years in climate finance. So this is a very large amount, obviously. And also, more importantly, in the adaptation, we delivered 12.9 billion US dollars in fiscal year 22. So these are the numbers that the World Bank has been providing to the emerging markets to date. So I just want to, since it was came out a few hours ago, I thought it was meaningful to just share with that. So to answer your question, I think it's a dilemma, and that we need to think through all the initiatives that we have. But what we are saying at the World Bank Group is really, we're thinking about development through the climate lens. So we call it GRID. Is the green, inclusive, and resilience development. So that's the framework that we look into all our activities currently we're doing. And one of the things that we're trying to promote is we're working with the government of Egypt with our country climate and development reports. And that really captures the uniqueness of each country's challenge, but at the same time gives a diagnosis of how we can achieve a net zero by 2050. And it gives you an insight of what kind of investment activities or what kind of private sector involvement is necessary.
But you're not investing or assisting any country in any fossil fuel at this stage anymore.
No, we are actually.
Even in coal-fired power plants.
There was in the previous
because I'm asking this, I just want to interject so people understand the context. I mentioned COP17 in South Africa in Durban. The World Bank gave South Africa $3.75 billion back in 2010, so it feels like yesterday. 3 billion of that went to coal-fired power plants.
Yes.
An area which I, by the way, grew up in, and then only 0.75 went to renewable energy. It's it's that now conversation where we've made mistakes. How do we then transition away from coal? Or is are developmental issues still priority for the World Bank?
So for coal, obviously we're not financing any new coal power project.
Yeah.
Instead we're trying to help the decommissioning of coal power projects. So that's a big agenda that we're pursuing with South Africa, with Indonesia, and a lot of countries that do still have coal power projects. We're not doing upstream oil and gas development financing, so we suspended that. But there was some discussion in the previous session that the MDBs are not financing gas generation projects, but we are. So under a certain kind of, in a specific context, we do think it makes sense. So recently we did a transaction, gas project in Bangladesh, where you don't have any land to build a panel solar project, when you don't have the wind. Like Egypt has this benefit of doing all those kind of activities. So it's really in the context of the country that we look into. And we look into develop and country in both aspects. And if it makes sense, we'll consider taking that.
Thank you for that. Malfada, I want to bring you in here because you're the CEO of the Climate Investment Funds at the World Bank as well. I want you to break some of the numbers down, what challenges, opportunities you're seeing within the space. And I want to talk about it from an African perspective.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the government of Egypt. Minister Rania, thank you very much for inviting us and hosting us in this beautiful place and all of the efforts. Yes, our experience. We have more than a decade of experience deploying risk concessional capital. There's a lot of conversation these days around blended finance and the role of blended finance. We have been doing it with our partner multilateral development banks for more than a decade. In Africa, gladly in Africa, we've actually deployed 30% of our capital. And we have deployed it both in the energy sector, but also in other sectors, agriculture, water, forestry. And have seen, these days there's also a lot of conversation around country platforms. And again, congratulating government of Egypt for launching the NUEFI platform and program. We have been also very supportive of this notion of country platforms since inception. In fact, we have been pioneering this model of bringing multiple financiers, the multilateral development banks, together with the governments and private sector in country to really pool capital and the comparative advantage of several financiers. Now what we are seeing with the JETPs in South Africa, and we will see it in Indonesia, in India, in Philippines, is taking this approach to a different level, a more ambitious level, and really not just pooling the capital of the multilateral development banks and governments and key bilaterals, but really trying to broaden it and really bring a lot of partners and financiers together and tackle both the investment barriers, but also, regulatory and policy barriers as well. We right now, at this point, we have a few strategic priorities, and certainly they apply for Africa as well. Energy transition. Yeah. We are not just supporting coal transition in South Africa, but we and elsewhere in other countries. But we have launched in Glasgow last year a really important investment program, which is around renewable energy integration. So everything related to storage solutions, transmission and distribution infrastructure, smart grid management. Those are really important investments when we are talking about scaling up power generation in renewables.
And this is a pivotal moment, right? Because Africa has a huge energy deficit. We should be spending billions on energy generation because that's going to hamper economic growth. So doing it right is vital. I also just, I want to go through all of our guests and then we can do some follow-up questions. Carrie Ann, good to see you. You're with the OECD and, you know, we know we've ascertained this huge gap. So the question is, how do we close it? What are the mechanisms? And one of the things that you guys focus on is, you know, the ability to mobilize local resources. Could you tell me about some of the work and some of the plans that you've put in place to help alleviate this gap?
Thank you. I'd like to back up a little bit, if I may, just to
Yeah.
comment on some of the questions here. I think we've been talking about projects and programs, and we heard a lot about that in the round table. Like, you have to have projects and programs so money will move toward them.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that we're talking about at the same time is policies. You have to have the policies. And that means policies both from the larger banks and the funders, if you will, and from the recipients. But a lot of this gets decided in the global governance setting. And I think really what we're talking about at this meeting is amplifying the African voice. And I think that's fundamental, and that's really something that OECD has put on its agenda. Just this year, the ministerial recognized that this was a priority, to work much more closely and in full partnership with Africa and the African countries that are struggling with this piece of the equation. I'm a scientist by training, not an economist. I might be the only one. But you have to have a source and you have to have a receptor.
Yeah.
And if the receptor doesn't function or has some problems, there can be a misperception.
So would you say policy is one of the biggest hindrances
I
to
think
getting climate finance?
I think policy is a big hindrance, and I think also the fact that the nations of Africa need to have their voices heard in some of these settings and in some of the ways that they may not have been present in the past. And so I think that what the OECD wants to do is work much more closely with Africa, and to that extent, we're working on a new partnership with the Africa Union Commission, and at that ministerial meeting, we were able to have the Senegalese President Macky Sall joining as chair of the AU at the current time. And we've been talking about what will be the dimensions of this partnership. How can we work better together in forums?
So how quickly can you get this done? Because the wheel of policy making turns slowly.
That's
in
right.
most parts of the world, and we have no time. This is a climate emergency.
It is a climate emergency, but as we can see, finance doesn't like to move quickly unless it sort of has a little certainty. So you have to definitely accelerate this. I'm not saying we can go at the usual rate, but we have to accelerate.
We have to expedite this. Mark, I want to come to you, and I've been listening to you all day, and I've been completely fascinated by some of the messaging that you've had. GFANZ is the private sector, coming together to commit trillions. I think it's $130 trillion. And then we've been asking ourselves, I've been talking with some of the experts, we're like, is this real? Is this money real? Does it really exist? Is it really going to change, chase climate finance projects across the world? And where does Africa sit with this? So how are you weighing this up?
Well, the first thing, it's real.
Yeah?
It's real. That is the balance sheet of the members of GFANZ who have all committed to take their balance sheets from where they were at Glasgow, and as those balance sheets turn them over in a way that's aligned to net zero consistent with Paris, okay? That's what their objective is to do. Now, when we went into Glasgow, the world was headed to 3.5, 3.8 degrees.
Yeah.
So it should not surprise you that on their balance sheets today, even though they're the better end of the financial spectrum, that there is a bunch of assets that have high emissions, that didn't have decarbonization plans. And what's happening is the process is to roll those over as loans mature, as investments are made, to look at whether or not those investments are going to be aligned, okay? And that's what's happening big picture. Now the question is, what does alignment mean in Africa?
Yes.
Very different things, whether you're in South Africa, you're in Egypt, you're in Senegal, you're elsewhere. The transition is multifaceted in Africa, and that's one of the reasons why today, and you were, Eleni, we were in sessions together, so you heard that we announced today the launch of GFANZ Africa Network, which is, I said, it's bringing GFANZ to Africa, but really Africa to GFANZ, because a lot of what we do is very boring, but incredibly important plumbing. The plumbing of finance is incredibly important. So how you account for things, what a net zero plan is, how you structure a market, how you clear a market, all those elements, that influences those financial decisions. But how you do that in New York or London or Singapore is different than how you should do it in Africa and even within Africa. So that's why you get the
Okay,
the
so of
voices
the
there.
130 trillion, since we saw this sort of being committed or put on the table at Glasgow, has any of that money come to fruition in terms of projects? Has
Well,
it been
look,
deployed?
okay, so let's go back to science here as well.
Okay.
Finance is a catalyst. What does a catalyst need? Carrie Ann knows this. The underlying components. What are the underlying components? The underlying components are projects
Yes.
and policy commitment. What we see with NUEFE is policy commitment and projects identified, and now we're in the process of translating those as the official sector, World Bank Group leading, others leading, EBRD, and the private sector getting engaged to translate those projects into financing for those projects, and that's the challenge that's there. So, think about somebody, if I can use another analogy very quickly, which is a mortgage at a bank. A bank doesn't force a mortgage on somebody. Somebody buys a house, a flat.
Yeah.
They make a decision. It's the same with a climate investment. What's happening in finance, though, is that because of this commitment, because of the commitment that came out of Glasgow, because of all the work and the focus, there is an enormous focus looking for projects, looking for opportunities, including now in Africa, that are consistent with that transition. Now, what we need to do, last point, I know you're short on time, is to make sure that it's consistent with an African transition, not a Canadian transition, European transition, which move at different speeds, different elements, different realities.
So let's go timeline again. Pardon my sense of urgency. I've been speaking to a lot of climate experts generally in my career, and I feel the code red. It's something that I don't stop thinking about. How quickly can we get this money to work in Africa? Let's be real. I mean, are you looking at timelines?
Of course, look, we're all conscious of the urgency of this, which is why those commitments were made. We're all conscious that the world has left this exceptionally late to mainstream and take seriously. We're all conscious that it took 11 years from that Copenhagen commitment to a form of commitment in Glasgow. And that underscores that ultimately the official sector is going to be important, but is not going to finance the whole. But it's all linked, Eleni. It's not, I mean, yes, the timeline, we have a very, Minister knows, and she's rightly said it, a very tight timeline over the next 59 and a quarter days before Sharm el-Sheikh to take the next big step in terms of financing here. That's the same in many other jurisdictions, and we have to use every hour.
Thank you. Dr. Mohaldin, I'd like for you to jump in here. I know you wanted to hear what everyone had to say, and we've been hearing a lot from you. And I guess this is now the moment of reality check. We're talking about implementation. My fear is, because since I started my career, policies seem to work well. Pledges are always fantastic. It's always somewhere that things go wrong with implementation. What is it that we can do to ensure we do not get derailed off this climate agenda path, especially for the African continent?
Right. Thank you so much. And before I answer your question, Eleni, let me say that NUEFE is a good thing. It's a common sense approach to dealing with the challenges that we are facing. And as far as we can invest better in the three areas identified, energy, water, agriculture, and food, everybody would be really relieved of many of the problems that our world is facing today in the major crisis, especially the African continent. So trying to solve that problem can go forever complaining about the fact that climate finance, like development finance, is insufficient, inefficient, and costly. Insufficient because of the gaps that you mentioned. Inefficient because for some funds, it takes them 3 to 4 years to release the money from the day they start shaking hands with ministers. And the fact that it's costly because in many cases, countries, developing economies, are pushed to borrow at a very high cost in order to deal with the priorities for adaptation mitigation, including the three areas of interest now. So in order to have a practical answer to that, my team and I, in many other areas of interest and busy schedules we have been very much occupied to answer what I called earlier Mark Carney's list, which is basically, it's not his list, he's been honest, reflecting the expectations of the investors where to put their money, not losing it. We're not talking about charity here, we're talking about business that is going to be looking for the golden rule, risk and return. So the list is, I think he mentioned a couple of issues, including the public policy matter, rule of law, governance, other matters. But we were very much busy with the help of BCG, the regional economic commissions of the UN, with the GFAN's representatives, with the presidency of the COP, and with the champions, to build that list of, I wouldn't say bankable, because that means that we are only relying on loans, but investable projects. So that has a proper mix between investment, where it should be investment, equity participation, and getting credit. The list so far is around 33 projects, 19 from Africa. This is a tentative list, and this is not a comprehensive one. There's just examples to the GFANs that there is some sort of a pipeline worthy of consideration, built by professionals, being verified by professionals, including members of the GFANs like HSBC, Citigroup, and other institutions. And I'm happy to tell the minister as well that the areas of interest, energy, infrastructure, water management, and food production have been really very much strong in the 19 projects from Africa, the 10 from Asia, and from the 4 cases in Latin America. The good cases as well that we have seen, especially from Latin America and a couple of African countries, that they are after financing their NDCs. So the nationally determined contributions have been guiding the work. And again, another initiative by Mark Carney and his colleagues is basically to get the NDCs and to see how can we make it some sort of guidance for investment going forward. So, and I'm happy that Egypt is one of the countries.
And you're on the GFAN's advisory board as well, sir, correct?
Come again?
You're on the GFAN's advisory board as well.
Yeah, that's being created.
So do you think that the expectations for climate financing in Africa are unrealistic?
So the man himself is here, so we can talk about the global GFAN's initiative. There are chapters that are being created, one in Asia, led by my good friend Ravi Menon, the head of the Financial Regulatory Authority of Singapore, with very able membership with him and good director for that chapter. Latin America is under preparation as well for that. And Africa, I'm happy that it was announced today and there is a press release. Our focus is going to be, as I told Mark, is going to be about the practical areas of work. It's about projects.
Yeah.
You were in Glasgow. What made the news? There are many things that made the news there. What made the news really? And this is your profession, Lenny. What was basically the most striking thing that
I felt
there?
that, you know, island
the South
nations,
African project.
Yes, exactly.
It's
but
the
also
South
island
African
nations
project.
were ignored
Whatever.
in a way. I think that there was, I don't know, there wasn't enough given in terms of the responsibility that needs to be taken by developed economies versus the impact that it's having on everyone else. And that's what really struck me.
Yeah, we'll have a discussion about the 100 billion, the role of development finance institutions, and how to get more public finance. But what made really the news is basically that South African project again, because it had all of the elements, including some of the elements of Nuafi today, phasing out from coal, investing in renewables, and dealing with the impact of the communities affected by that. It's still under construction, but we're really looking forward to the outcomes of that.
Thank you so much. I just want to welcome the Honorable Dr. Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Nigeria. Ma'am, welcome. I'm getting you a microphone. Thank you for being in our audience, and I'd like to ask you a question. And my question to you is that, firstly, we've realized with the geopolitics that are playing out, the sensitivities, how delicate it is. Energy security is so delicate, but in Africa we know how delicate energy security is. And we know how it impacts livelihoods. And we're having this discussion about, Africa playing its part. And again, it keeps coming up, the responsibility that needs to be taken by the world's biggest emitter, I think historically is the US. If you look at the most carbon dioxide that has been emitted, Right now, China is the biggest emitter currently. The US is second, and we've got other countries that we could look at. Do you think that it is fair that Africa should be, looking at concessional loans, where it's going to be spending a lot of money on the climate agenda, or do you think we should be having a serious discussion about donor funding, for example, and how are you viewing this? Because we've ascertained already from Hippolyte, we don't have enough fiscal space across the continent to be able to spend $250 billion on these projects.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Let me congratulate Ranier and the government of Egypt for organizing this excellent event. It seems to me as if, on the one hand, we make progress, and on the other hand, we hear some statements and words that are really concerning for us. Yes, Africa is the least emitter, and it is true. At least for my country in Nigeria, there is a very huge electricity deficit.
Yeah.
So when we say we need gas as a transition forward, it's really for survival. It's for our people to be able to have some basic things that people in developed countries take for granted, to be able to have clean water and just basic electricity to run day-to-day things. If we are not getting reasonably priced financing to develop gas, it means we're denying the citizens in our countries the opportunity to just attain basic development. And I heard someone, we had a meeting last week in DC that said, this investment in gas that you want to do domestically, it will take about 5 years to roll out, and then at least 20 years before you recover your investment. So why do it? Why don't you just produce the gas for export and use the revenues to acquire cleaner source of fuel? But that's what we've been doing all this time. So we've been producing gas, we've been exporting, and we have not developed gas infrastructure enough to be able to help industry to grow, which is what we require to reduce the poverty in our country, to reduce the unemployment rates. So it's really important for us to be given this room so that this financing is available. The developed countries are the leaders in the multilateral institutions. So if they don't lean towards to help us, we will not get this finance. We just get a lot of running around. Somebody said from the time they shake your hand, 4 years on, you haven't yet accessed the finance. So they're not saying no, but you're not getting the financing as well. And it's making us to regress. So I do hope COP27 will be a time for us to really talk frankly and for us to be listened to, for everyone to understand that we're not at the same level. And this transition that we all seek needs to be just and it needs to be equitable.
Thank you so much, Minister. I'm going to mention something else because I've covered this in the past few weeks. You know, the DRC is very keen on drilling at the Virunga National Park or close to. And the argument has also been, and they understand that there's going to be an impact on the environment. The one thing that struck me in our coverage was that if we have a carbon basin, the second largest in the world to the Amazon, why aren't we getting money for it, right? Why aren't we getting paid to capture carbon? What are the other, exciting carbon credit markets that we could be looking at? Why can't we drill so that we can have economic prosperity while everyone else is extracting, but we cannot extract, right? And I understand, and trust me, I get this. I want a better life for my daughter and her daughter, so climate agenda is absolutely vital. But what do we say to the DRC in their argument? Who wants to tackle this? I know it's polarizing. Dr. Mohaldin?
No, I don't think that they need to go far. DRC, they just need to check next door what's happening in Gabon, because Gabon just is been developing its carbon credit market. I think the minister from Gabon was with us, Minister White, and he is developing a carbon market that he describes, and rightly so, that is serving the national needs. And he has the same issue that the forests are there, and he needs really to create this kind of market in order to support the development there, and is in partnership with the EU in order to do that.
Yeah.
So we need really to establish sophisticated but tailored carbon credit markets for different needs. And here partnerships would be really very much needed. That's why I emphasize that what we need from the partners, not just the money, is the technical cooperation that could help us developing our carbon markets for different needs. There is another one being created in Egypt as well, and reaching out to solve different problems from the forest case. But developing carbon market based on principles, based on good regulatory framework, and benefiting especially from the experience of Europe, not to copy or carbon copy what's happening there, but at least to tailor it for the needs. So the solution is there. I encourage DRC to look next door.
Yeah. We don't have much time left. We have enough time to get comments from everyone. I'm going to leave it open to each of you to decide how you want to close this, because it's going to set the tone and the agenda for the rest of the week. And I want to keep in mind some of the biggest issues and perhaps some of the stuff that's keeping you up at night or that you're thinking about. Dr. Rane, do you want to start?
I think we can keep on dwelling on challenges, but I want to maybe talk about some positives.
Yeah.
First, I think there's convergence on what's important and what's urgent. If I remember before going to Glasgow and then after Glasgow, there's been a lot of streamlining in the rhetoric, and I think that's a positive thing. It's positive in the sense that everyone's talking about implementation now. Everybody recognizes that the private sector needs to be there. Countries are doing their national strategies, but everybody's saying ODA and concessional is not enough. There is a lot of exchange and learning that is taking place at a pace faster than before. When we say every stakeholder has something to do, we're trying to show how to do that. So there's a lot on the agenda to be done, and as we evolve as humans, there will be always more to do. But I just feel a little bit more structured in the way we are all trying to push messages in a framework. That's my positive, optimistic upside spirit, and that's maybe because we have deadlines that are coming up, but we have the partners here. Today was a demonstration that we can come together and we can have consistent messages. This is what happened in each of the speeches this morning, and also to see the collective spirit during the roundtable in Nouafi is something positive. Now, when we meet next year, we will be able to say that we have achieved.
You do work at the speed of light. You are known to implement very quickly. So we're so glad that you're part of this team and you're launching amazing projects. I want to hear from everyone. We can start at the end, so yeah.
Well, I just want to echo what the minister said. But I do think that in the past 2 or 3 years, we saw a big change in how we have this kind of dialogue. And this is really the leadership for the minister and others, and also for Mark, for the private sector. But I originally came from the private sector. I came into this industry, a different kind of perspective. But in the past 2 or 3 years, really, I think the private sector has become more serious in all the ESG kind of agenda. So from my point of view, I think on the MDB side, we have the know-how. We have the intellectual kind of tools, or the diagnostics, or the analytical tools to understand what was needed. Yeah. And it's really how to translate that into the private sector and make it happen. To be frank, it'll take time. But that said, so far I think we're making great progress, and I just want to thank everyone on the panel for their efforts they're making.
Thank you so much. Al-Fada.
Yeah, I want to make a positive note here as well. We started off at the Climate Investment Funds with our partner MDBs back in 2008, 2009, in a year of a financial crisis, where we saw private capital flows moving away from emerging markets, from low-income countries, where we didn't have many investments, climate investments to speak of. In most of the countries that we have invested, there hadn't been any renewable energy investment. And we saw governments, developing country governments and private sector companies invest, make tough, difficult investment decisions on the basis of involvement of relevant partners and with the right type of capital. We came in, as I said, to provide risk capital, to do what the private sector couldn't do, what MDBs couldn't do by themselves either. So I think we have that history of an experience that difficult investment decisions can be made. They have been made in the past. Now it's really a matter of investing enough effort and willingness and solidarity in really putting sufficient amount of capital, public capital, available that can de-risk the private sector. We need to use the public capital now differently. It really needs to be very targeted, more targeted than in the past, to really bring about the flows, the scale of private capital investments that are needed in Africa and elsewhere. But I want to leave with this positive note that we have seen countries in Africa, we have seen countries in other parts of the world, we have seen private sector companies make difficult investment decisions in the past, and they will do them again.
And they need to, if we can repeat that model, that would be exciting. Hippolyte.
No, thank you very much. I would like to also join my panelists in really closing on a very positive note as the Minister really put forward to us. I think there's been a lot of convergence on the climate change agenda. And we are also very pleased to see that increasingly there is a focus, emphasis on nature-based solutions, which are really low-cost solutions, which can have tremendous impact in terms of carbon capture, but also in terms of generating the revenue needed to close that climate financing gap. It's very important to stress that out, and Africa has a natural comparative advantage on that front. There's also been some very positive development. If you look at what happened with green bond issuance, crossing the half a trillion dollar threshold and set to hit 1 trillion sometime next year, that's significant. And the question we have, how do we make sure that the green bond issuance is not tainted by the same stigma, which actually excluded African entities from that global capital market? I think that's key in ensuring that there's a global convergence in the issue of addressing climate change. We're also very pleased by what has been happening in the DFI space in particular. I think increasingly we see emerging innovative financing solutions in that space. If you look at Afreximbank, I think our REPAC program, which enable us to actually tailor project for specific investors, will actually help a lot in crowding in funding to ensure that we achieve multiplier. But very important to go back to the point made earlier is that we need government, the donors, as the starting point to really bring more resources into this space. That's critical. And we believe that there will not be really just transitions without a just climate financing. I think this time, the cost of going the other way will be significant, not just for Africa, but for the world as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Mahaldin. Could you keep it short, please?
Yeah, well, you know me, so I'll keep it short. Okay. We have been together in many panels. Well, it gets longer after 7 p.m. Anyways, so we have been all suffering from greenwashing. My good friend here brought as well green exclusion, and this is because of the cost of borrowing and the cost of verification and all of that. That needs to be fixed. And there is some good piece from a good friend of us, and Mark, of course, former Minister McKenna of Canada. She's working on a very important piece about the new rules of engagement in this space. We look forward to see her recommendations on that. But very practically, I think we don't have the luxury to pick and choose of sources of finance. Mobilize public finance, that starts with the budget of the state, and it needs to be fully aligned with what we're talking about, because climate finance is development finance. This is one. The second part is about the private sector. Here, the offer is there from the GFANs and others. So for the ministers, for those who build projects in the room, please bring your projects to at least the African chapter and the GFANs network. The capital commitment, the assets commitment are there. The challenge, get us the projects that can keep the GFANs busy, and then we start getting the machinery working. The final thing, we need really to use borrowing as a last resort.
Yes.
And in presence of the World Bank Group and others, worked there for 10 years, I'm happy with what they do. The money comes with knowledge, which is great. But at the same time, grants should be preferred. Investment is great as well, because it comes with risk-taking and partnerships. And then when you go for borrowing, it should be long-term. Grace period should be longer. Cost should be more affordable.
Yeah.
Are we creating something new? It's basically getting IDA to be extended in its service. This is the International Development Association. Get the IDA-based. That doesn't mean that only World Bank can do it. Get the IDA-based principles of finance extended to middle-income countries, because half of the African countries are not low-income countries anymore. So they need this kind of IDA-based finance as an important resource to support the private sector and the governments. So going back to some basic that worked well, and by the way, IDA is super efficient compared to some of the funds that take 3 to 4 years. And if you come, please, Eleni, when you have somebody from these funds bragging about what they do, and they spend 3 or 4 years, please don't give them airtime. Thank you.
Okay.
Mark, go ahead.
Okay, you had a small rebellion on the panel to
We do.
be more positive. I'm going to stay in the positive vein and pick up on comments of my colleagues. 2 Ds, reasons to be positive. First is around data. Hiroshi, Hippolyte, others talked about the convergence. I think we undersell a bit how much things have shifted in the last couple of years. A couple facts. 30% of global emissions covered by net zero commitments 2.5 years ago, over 90% of global emissions by country commitments. 5 trillion financial assets, over 130 financial assets. 500 companies, over 10,000 companies. Those real numbers. Now, that they have to, those commitments, those pledges need to be turned into action. But that is all part of the mainstreaming of this into the dialogue. And these are hard numbers. It's real data. You can measure whether or not people are making progress or not. And there will be differences in speed with which people make. But we won't have anecdote and impression. We'll have hard numbers. And to that point, I just want to salute the OECD alongside because the net zero data public utility, which we're developing in conjunction with the OECD, the IMF, others, but housed at the OECD, hugely important because that's single source, open source, all stakeholders will be able to access from about this time next year for financial institutions and the underlying company plans. Last D, more quickly, but more importantly, it's not just about net zero as we've been hearing rightly here, it's development, it's all aspects of development, it's interlinkages, that's what we see with NUEFE, and your charge was as we move forward, it's both of those Ds, both of those elements moving forward. We have to, the necessary condition is getting to net zero. We all know that, and we can all measure it and track it. That's the data.
Is GFANS going to invest in WEFE, by the way?
Well, we're working with WEFE,
Fantastic.
And it's the individual institutions, obviously, that will do it. But that's the exciting thing
This is the
about
kind
it,
of
is that we're
project
moving
that
forward.
excites you,
Well, it is a banner approach which has 9 specific projects which would then drop down to specific investment opportunities and lending opportunities, yes.
Fantastic.
Time's-
I'll be
time's
holding you to that commitment to
Well,
invest in WEFE.
it's a commitment to work to get there. Again, this is, let's be
No,
clear.
I'm just saying next year I'm going to be holding you to it,
Holding me to what?
to investing in WEFE.
No, that's not what I said. I said we're working in order to do that. This is the thing about hard numbers. This is the thing about climate, is in the end, you have to have hard projects that actually work, that are financed.
Fantastic.
And it's not, if you want to move away from people said X at some conference and then what do they do Y, then you have to be precise about your language. And I'm being very precise about my language. Now, I'm very confident at the same time that the commitment is there of the Egyptian government. It's the right approach. It has both Ds, and the institutions will work to get there.
I get it. You have to look at the data to see if it makes sense. But I like to hold people to account. Unfortunately, Kerry and Talia.
Thank you. Well, do I have the last word?
Yes.
Oh, good. Because I think that I'm very glad you pushed us, Minister, to end on a upbeat note. I think we have learned a lot, and I know we are in a very urgent moment. There is absolutely no denying that. But we are so much further than where we started. We have a long way to go. We have learned public finance is not enough. We have learned public policy has got to mobilize more private finance. And we have learned that as much as it has a slow rate constant, policy matters. And we're going faster, but a lot of it is based on transparent, open data, sharing regulations and standards, and understanding how to develop local policies. And so these are hard things. They're not things that are going to happen fast, but I think we have a tremendous amount to be proud of, because I would say maybe 3 years ago we could not have a conversation like this. And so the data, the openness, the partnership has all made a huge difference. So it's an urgent moment, but we're making forward progress.
Fantastic. Dr. Rani, I just quickly want to get a sense from you. I know I said we're almost done, but one last thing, very quickly.
No, I just want to thank everyone for staying so late for a very tough panel in terms of topics.
Yeah.
But I think we ended with a positive note. And again, international cooperation and partnerships is the important way forward to be able to meet what everyone wants to see, and that is climate being intertwined in development and reaching the 1.5% at some point. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Round of applause for my fantastic panelists. Thank you. Thank you. It was great. Thank you.